Hello and welcome to this Gowling WLG webinar on the recent EU referendum vote. Today we'll be asking what implications are there following the vote for trustees, employers and the pensions industry in the UK. I'm Ian Chapman-Curry, a member of Gowling WLG's firm-wide Brexit unit and a principal associate in our pensions team. I'm joined this afternoon by Glyn Ryland. Good afternoon, Glyn.
Good afternoon, Ian. Good to be here.
Glyn's a partner in our pensions team and he'll be providing us with the benefit of his extensive experience on the legal and governance aspects of scheme investment and funding and dealing with employer covenant issues. So coming up, first, I'll be examining why the vote itself has had an impact and why uncertainty will be the overarching theme for the foreseeable future. I'm then going to move on to consider the immediate impact on pensions in the UK, looking at the legal framework for pensions and asking whether there are any immediate changes to the statutory regime, case laws, guidance and regulation.
Then I'll move on to look from a legal and governance perspective at immediate pension scheme funding, investment risk and volatility issues before focusing on employer or sponsor covenant. And if ever there was an advert for the regulator's integrated risk management approach, I think this might be it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then I'm going to finish up by looking at some practical next steps and actions for trustees and employers to consider. So today's webinar is due to last for about 30 minutes. It might be a few minutes longer if we cover some of your questions at the end. And we'd really encourage questions. Just click on the Ask a Question tab, type in your question and click Submit. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the time available, but we will get back to everyone on questions, even if that's offline if necessary. Before we get started, just some simple housekeeping points. The webinar has a few simple controls. The most important are the volume adjustment and the full screen option, which are at the bottom right hand side of the player. And finally, we thought you'd be thoroughly fed up with opinion polls by now, so we've limited ourselves to just 2 simple questions towards the beginning and end of the webinar, and these should just flash up on screen with an option to vote. So, which way now for pensions? On Thursday, the 23rd of June, a majority of those voting in the referendum voted for the UK to leave the European Union. And this has opened up a constitutional and economic Pandora's box, with a swarm of difficult issues and complicated problems flying out into public view and media scrutiny. And the only thing that seems clear as of today is that those of us working in the pensions industry are going to have to get used to an even higher level of uncertainty than usual. And there are 2 main reasons why things are so uncertain. It's not clear how we're going to leave, and it's not clear when we're going to leave. So with that just hanging in the air, we're going to go through to the first poll. Polls should be coming on screen any moment. And what we're asking is your initial views or gut feelings on what impact, if any, the vote to leave the European Union will have on the pensions industry in the UK. And the options are a negative impact, it won't have any impact, a positive impact, or it's just too early to tell. And we're just getting the results coming through. People are just voting. I'm just going to leave it a few more seconds for people to carry on voting. There does seem to be a fairly clear consensus emerging that the majority of you, it's coming back a little bit now. Okay, so that's a very interesting split. There's approximately 40% of you think that it's going to have a negative impact. Maybe a bit less, 35%, and a majority of you think it's just too early to tell. So very few of you think it's going to have a positive impact or won't have any impact at all. So maybe we've got an audience that's made up of some optimists, some pessimists, and some people who've seen this sort of thing too many times before to say that it's too early now. But we'll go on to the first reason as to why this is uncertain, and that's because it's not clear which door we're going to choose to leave the European Union, and which door we pick is going to be key to determine how much of an impact this is going to have on pensions in the UK. Of course, the least impact would be if the government ignores the referendum vote and we ended up staying in the European Union. Politically, however, this could be just as unstabilising as the Brexit vote, and it looks increasingly unlikely, certainly if you see the comments from the leading contenders for the Conservative Party leadership election. So a second option is to try and preserve as much access to the European Union's single market as possible, and this would be through membership of the European Economic Area, and this has been labelled the Norwegian option. This provides a level of integration between the European Union and the European Economic Area such that it would have a similarly marginal impact on UK pensions. Effectively, European Union policy on pensions is likely to apply in those circumstances. One thing that also applies under a Norwegian model is the free movement of people. And so if this becomes an intractable sticking point to full access to the single market, we might decide to fall back on what's been called the Swiss model. And that's membership of the European Free Trade Association with a whole series of bilateral agreements. The Swiss are currently up to 120, and it's taken them over 30 years to get to that position. But on that basis, there could be a divergence between EU pensions policy and what the UK does, and there could also start to be an impact on the UK's financial services sector and its ability to sell services into the European single market. Going forward, an even looser arrangement would be based on an entirely bespoke UK-EU bilateral approach. So something similar to what Canada has just put in place with the European Union that itself took 7 years, or a bespoke approach such as Turkey has with its customs union and bilateral trade agreements. This would probably see UK pension policy outside of the European framework, so you're starting then to see a material divergence from the European Union system. And finally, if nothing is agreed, or if there's a gap between finishing up on exit negotiations and finalising a trade agreement, the UK would then revert to World Trade Organization rules in terms of its trading with the single market. And it's clear then that pensions policy would be set in the UK, but employers and trustees would then have to grapple with the economic and investment consequences of abandoning free trade with our largest trading partners. And we've already had some interesting questions on this. So one question focused on the extent to which trustees would be able to continue to receive financial advice and professional services from a provider based in a European Union member state. So where those services are currently passported into the UK without necessarily having to be in the UK or subject to the UK's domestic regulators. And as you hopefully have seen from that array of options that are available to us, the answer to that isn't clear because it will entirely depend on what exit plan we choose for the United Kingdom. It could be, if we choose the European Economic Area or continued EU membership, that there is no change whatsoever, all the way through to that being problematic and new rules and regulations having to be in place. So the second key element of uncertainty is uncertainty over how soon we're going to exit the European Union, if that is the direction that we go in. Assuming that we take the full 2 years that's allowed once we've triggered Article 50 of the Treaty of European Union, the earliest exit date is likely to be September 2018, so that's 2 years after the installation of whoever wins the Conservative Party leadership and his, or increasingly likely her, entering number 10 to become Prime Minister. And it's worth noting that that is just the process for legally taking the UK out of the European Union. Putting in place a comprehensive trade agreement may take even longer. So at the moment, it's clear that it's going to be years at the very least, and in the most protracted scenario, possibly up to a decade before we have the clear and comprehensive settlement that the markets and many in the pensions industry are craving. Pension schemes operate with an eye on the long term, but even for them, this is going to be an uncomfortably long period of uncertainty. So what actually does change now as a result of the vote? I'm going to be looking at the legal framework for pensions in the UK before passing over to Glyn, who's going to look at the investment, funding, risk and volatility, and also the strength of the employer-sponsor covenant. So what changes now in terms of pensions law? The legal framework for pensions in the UK is exactly the same on Friday the 24th of June as it had been the day before. The vote has changed everything in politics, but it changes nothing in law. The referendum was non-binding and did not, in and of itself, trigger the UK's exit from the EU or even trigger Article 50 to start the clock ticking on that process. So that means that all of the primary and secondary legislation, case law, including European case law, and regulatory guidance remains in force and unchanged. Last week, the Financial Conduct Authority confirmed this and noted that it would implement any current in-flight or developing EU legislation whilst we remained a member of the EU. Depending on the exit route we choose, it may stay that way. The more access we have to the single market, the more likely it is that we're going to be bound by European pensions and employment legislation in the future. And even if we decide to leave in such a way that repatriates pensions policy back to Westminster, there's still likely to be no immediate change. And the reasons for that are twofold. The first is that most EU pensions and employment legislation is adopted in the form of directives. Member states have to give effect to EU directives by passing national legislation. And so in the UK, the bulk of pensions legislation that's come from Europe has found its way into Pensions Act, Finance Act, and a plethora of regulations, which are going to continue to have the force of law until repealed or amended by further legislation. So what if Westminster does want to make changes? It seems that the second limb as to why this isn't going to happen soon is relevant then. Pensions policy is unlikely to be at the forefront of the government's agenda as it wades through far more pressing issues that are raised by the UK leaving the European Union. As a result, it seems unlikely that a government will have the time or political will to implement sweeping reforms of a system that fundamentally does work. But it's not impossible that a more radical administration with a particularly business-friendly agenda and a determination to consign EU red tape to the bonfire will not take a hatchet to the established legal framework for pensions. Depending on the way that we leave the European Union, we may also avoid some new European pensions legislation or obligations. Examples of those are the General Data Protection Regulation, which will have to be adopted by all member states on the 25th of May 2018, IORP 2, which has just been adopted by the European institutions and where member states have 2 years to bring that into force in their national legislation. GMP equalisation, which is something that arises out of European case law, and there is uncertainty as to the extent to which that will have to be given effect by trustees, and even things like VAT, the rules for which are determined at a European level. So there's 4 issues that we thought we would be having to deal with as an industry, and it's just not clear to what extent or for how long we will have to deal with any of those, or for how long they might be in effect, for example, if we are still member states in over 2 years' time. So there's no immediate worries for trustees and employers in terms of pensions law, but we're going to be keeping a close eye on those developments. Investment and funding decisions are, however, a very different story. So I'm now going to pass on to Glyn to cover those.
Thanks, Ian. So we're now on to the slide headed What Now? Economics. And the 3 headings there won't surprise anyone who's been reading recent regulator output. Obviously, trustees are going to need to look at investment risk, how their investments and the market volatility relating to them going to impact on what they're holding, how will currency changes affect them, and so on. Funding risk. Does the prospect of the UK leaving the EU change the funding position? We've already seen changes to gilt yields, which will change the stated funding position of many schemes, although of course the amount necessary to pay the benefits doesn't actually change. And covenant risk. How good a bet is the employer now that this Brexit vote has happened, particularly if it has involvements in the EU and so on? Have its prospects changed? So already you can see straight away that the regulator's integrated risk management approach is highly relevant, which is why Ian referred to it earlier on. And on the one hand, that might seem to many pensions people like a 45-page statement of the absolutely obvious, because it's effectively a summary of the earlier guidance notes. But if you look at the diagram on page 5, there's a triangle showing at each of its corners investment risk, funding risk and covenant risk, all set within the circle of overall risk management, which on the one hand seems very trite, but on the other hand, if you're looking at things from where we are now, you might think that trite is right, because from a legal and government's perspective, that guidance would take some beating as a mental framework through which to approach this whole series of problems. So I've mentioned volatility. What do we mean by that? Well, people will know that the FTSE has not been that badly affected. It's of course measured in pounds, and it relates to companies with a worldwide perspective and revenue stream normally, so you wouldn't expect it to have been that badly affected. In fact, you'd have expected it, all other things being equal, to go up because the value of the pound has fallen. So looking at the more relevant index, perhaps the FTSE 250, which is on that slide, it saw its biggest ever two-day fall, followed by a recovery amounting to about half or slightly over half of the loss measured in pound terms. But moving on, the value of the FTSE index measured in US dollar terms, so that is, if you like, a bird's eye view of the UK from the outside, looking at not only the loss in value in those companies, but also the diminution in the value of the pounds in which they're measured. If you add those up, you get the purple line showing that there has been a bigger dip and a similar proportionate recovery, but still a much bigger overall loss. So you've got currency risk built in there, as well as the loss itself. And just going on now to look at the currency itself, you can see why that has arisen, because there's the movement in the pound versus the dollar over a similar period.
And there's quite a big difference there for the FTSE 250 between a 5% fall, which you might see as a marginal correction, and a 15% fall, which is looking like a far more fundamental correction in those terms.
That's right. And then this morning, Mark Carney's been speaking at about 11 o'clock, trying to head some of these issues off. He's announced a £150 billion release in bank reserving requirements, which effectively frees up that much money to be lent and used in the UK economy, which is obviously attempting to solve a problem before it's really hit us, which I'm sure is a sensible move, whether it actually works or not. So moving on to the next slide, what changes now from a trustee perspective in investments? So we've talked quickly about market volatility and investment risk, so I'm going to look at the 4 bullet points under the specific risk issues headings from a trustee perspective. Counterparty credit risk, given the downgrade of credit ratings, trustees are going to need to get their advisors to look at whether termination rights have been triggered either against them or are now triggerable by them, and that's definitely an area where advisor input is needed. It's pretty technical. Flowing from that, or instead of that, there might be margin calls on derivative positions, and those might of course be made against the trustee or by them against their counterparties. Either way, you need to know whether the relevant party has got the relevant assets, and particularly if you're the trustees, you need to make sure that you are ready for those calls if they come in. And moving on from there, the trustees will have taken an approach to risk tolerance and investment strategy review. They will need to go back and look at that again. What is their risk tolerance now? Is it higher because we're in an inherently more risky world, so that's a more proportionate approach to the world we're in? Or is it lower because they're in such a risky world that they want to actually minimise the amount of risk they're taking and batten down the hatches a bit before whatever is about to happen next? And of course all of this is at least as important for DC trustees. I think that's something that the market now understands more than it would have done a few years ago. But it's vital that you not only have the right options available to your members and that they are decent options of their type, but also that that's been communicated fairly. Something which might have been described as low risk last month might no longer be suitably described as low risk, and trustees should perhaps be looking at those things to make sure that they are giving their members a fair chance of reacting on a personal level appropriately to the situations that they're in. So looking at some of those issues in a bit more detail, and of course it needs to be emphasised we are lawyers here, we're not giving investment consultancy, actuarial or covenant advice, but the governance and the mechanism by which trustees approach these issues I think is fundamentally a legal issue, so it's a good approach for us to take. So what about funding? We've already seen some impacts. The UK government gilt yields have strangely enough, fallen, even though the UK government credit rating has fallen. You expect yields to rise if an issuer is less creditworthy. They've fallen, and bond yields have risen. So the market's reaction to the British government having a lower likelihood of repaying its debt is to be so worried that it's moving out of corporate bonds and into sovereign debt, because that's a less risky thing, also it perceives.
In fact, to such an extent that on Friday we saw two bond issues from the British government that were trading in negative territory for the first time, and also for the first time the entire Swiss government portfolio of debt was trading negatively.
So people are so worried that they're actually willing to pay a government to look after their money instead of expecting an interest return on their money. I think that's enough on funding changes. What about covenant strength? Well, this, of course, is going to be extremely employer-specific, all covenant assessments are. But it's already an issue for trustees. They've had British Steel, they've had BHS. They're already concerned about covenants. That's what we're seeing in trustee meetings. So they're going to be looking all the more carefully now at the financial position of their sponsors, how the size of the scheme's pension liabilities and deficits in particular now compare to the value of their sponsors. And of course that could be a good news story if your sponsor group is predominantly a European or an American group. The size of the deficit measured in pounds is now less frightening than it was a few days ago. So it's not all bad news here. In what sector does the employer operate? Is it in a sector which everyone believes will be very badly affected by a Brexit, or is it not? And it's not for me to comment on which those sectors are, but you can read many views on that in any Sunday paper, or any other day of the week paper actually. And what are the overall macroeconomic conditions, and how are they going to affect the employer and its performance and its ability to generate cash to meet deficits in the future? So I think those are the key issues, and there are some sectors which are said to be particularly vulnerable, and particularly trustees in those areas will be interested. Anybody with particular interest in currency fluctuations will also be, I think, particularly concerned.
So trustees are really going to have to grapple with potentially a weakening employer covenant in some situations, at the same time that scheme funding is really taking a hammering. I know that Hymans Robertson have put out figures where the aggregate deficit for UK defined benefit schemes has risen to 935 billion last week. Anything else that the Bank of England does to improve the economic situation, whether that is a further round of quantitative easing, which seems likely, or a further cut in interest rates, which could happen but seems slightly less likely, but the impact of that is going to be even worse on scheme funding, just at a time when trustees are having to deal with a whole range of other issues.
Yeah, to the extent they're not matched. And on the plus side, one of the things Mark Carney said this morning was that the markets have effectively done their job. They've reflected a change. They've reacted sensibly. I don't think he used the word sensibly, but he implied that they were functioning as you would expect, and that everything he's doing is pushing us towards a stable and rational rather than emotive reaction to what's going on, which must be the right thing for anyone in his position to be doing. So what do the trustees need to look out for? Well, I've mentioned one. The first one, triggering and reporting certain things under derivative contracts is going to be crucial, but also looking at the first bullet point there, the triggering and reporting of funding obligations on the employer. Have there been any changes that are so radical that action needs to be taken? Has there, looking at the second bullet point, for example, been a credit rating downgrade of the employer or its group, or of an investment counterparty? All of these things are to some extent linked, but also distinct from each other. Is there a materially higher level of risk so that the SIP needs to be reviewed and amended? And overall, I think this is the overriding point that comes out of all of these things, is that trustees need to be having, I would say, quick informal chats with their core advisors in this area, their investment consultant, their scheme actuary, and their covenant advisors, not to commission a big piece of work, not to get stuck into things in a heavy way unless the initial chat indicates that more thought is necessary. I suspect some holiday plans will be cancelled over the summer in some of those organisations, but overall I think the best way to protect yourself as a trustee right now is to have those conversations and document them rather than launching into precipitative action of any kind.
So are the holiday plans going to cancel because of the amount of work, or because no one can afford to go on holiday anymore?
Bit of both, actually. So back to Ian at that point.
Yeah, so I'm just going to be looking at some of the next steps and actions, and these are just some of the sensible, commercial, pragmatic actions that trustees and employers might want to consider in the aftermath of the vote and the turbulence and uncertainty that they're having to deal with. So Glyn's already highlighted integrated risk management, and that's a really sensible place to start. It's a mechanism by which trustees can sensibly engage with risk, especially risk that is as complicated and nuanced as Brexit, where the impact will be on all aspects highlighted by integrated risk management. So in terms of investment, scheme funding, covenant, the whole triangle of risk is affected potentially by Brexit. The pensions regulator has made a big focus of IRM over the past few months since it published guidance on it in December 2015, and this is going to be a real test for that methodology and how useful it is going to be. It's important to note that IRM is not a panacea or a solution in and of itself. It's a set of tools that enables trustees to identify risks and make better decisions. And like with any system such as this, its quality depends on the quality and time that's put into it. So the quality of information that's put in and the time that trustees and their advisors spend on it. The second point would be to engage professional advisors, and again, Glyn has commented on this. It's a good time to speak to professional advisors, if nothing else, to make sure that the people that you have in place are up to speed, monitoring developments, and are committed to providing the trustees with the information that they need, and also to open up those channels to make sure the trustees can take prompt action whenever this is required. But as Glyn noted, we're not suggesting that trustees take urgent, precipitative or provocative action. They just need to make sure that they are keeping tabs of what's happening and have all of the advice ready for them.
I'd say as well, perhaps those conversations, once they've been had, could usefully be reported back on to the next trustee meeting, so there is a visible sign of trustees having monitored and had appropriate governance in relation to those issues, even if the product of those conversations is that nothing needs to be done now.
Yeah, and I think the pensions regulator would be pretty clear that risk in all its myriad forms should be a standing point on trustee agendas, and particularly for the next batch of trustee meetings. I think this is going to form a lot of the discussion for trustees. The pensions regulator is keen that trustees and employers discuss issues early and often, so an encouragement for employer and trustee engagement. That's to open up channels of conversation and to understand how the employer is dealing with that. It's not necessarily to go in with all guns blazing in terms of employer covenant issues, or at least not until trustees have taken proper professional advice. The suitability of investment strategies and options is something that Glyn has talked about. If risk is elevated, if we're living in completely different times to when the SIP was agreed, it might be time to revisit the SIP, or at least get advice on whether it remains suitable. But the SIP may well remain suitable because fundamentally the world has changed, and so the risk profiling may still stack up, but it would be sensible to at least examine that. Another step would be to take due diligence on existing investments and contracts. So trustees and their advisors can check existing investment contracts, such as derivatives and swap instruments, to understand the triggers for termination and margin calls. That's going to enable them to react a lot more quickly if anything is needed to be done in terms of a rating downgrade or a call on collateral. In the longer term, trustees are also going to potentially have to consider issues around financial and professional services being passported into the UK from former colleague countries remaining in the European Union. Finally, on communications, we've had a report of spikes in queries from members who are concerned about the safety of their pension savings. Trustees may want to consider issuing a statement to members in order to reassure them that they're taking appropriate steps and monitoring the situation, and reminding them that the fundamental system of safeguards and protections remain in place. So we're just going to finish up now and have the poll again. That's just being pushed over to you. In the meantime as well, if you've got any questions, you can push those through to us, and we'll deal with those in the time that we have left, and also take them offline if necessary. The poll we're asking is a repeat of what we asked at the start. So after having had half an hour of me and Glyn talking about the European Union, Brexit and the vote, do you think the impact of the vote to leave the European Union on the pensions industry is going to be a negative impact? It won't have any impact. it'll be a positive impact, or it's just too early to tell. And we're getting in a lot of responses again. I'll just give you a few seconds to make sure everyone has had a chance to vote on that. Glyn, what's your gut feeling on this?
Well, it's the same as our voters, which is actually there's been a move away from a distinct view that it's negative and slightly towards the view that it's too early to tell. I think so many of the areas we've been talking about, it is too early to tell. And in fact, we've had a question which I can look at while we're watching these numbers come in, which points out that an exit from a single market would weaken the covenant of firms that trade in it. To some extent, that must be right. And pointing out that 40% of motor components are sourced from it. I mean, I wouldn't argue with that there has to be a strong point in that observation. But the point I was making earlier was not that an exit would itself strengthen anybody's economy, but simply that the value and cost of replacing a deficit which is measured in pounds is now lower for a group which measured its wealth in euros than it used to be, because the
10% lower.
10% lower.
Exactly.
The deficit in terms has gone down. And in fact, now that the numbers have stabilised, there is a larger number of, as a proportion of the people responding, which is about the same, a significantly larger proportion of you think that it is too early to tell, and a slightly smaller proportion have concluded it's a negative impact. The number of people who've concluded it will have no impact has dropped to 0, and there's still a small minority who see this as having a positive impact.
So we might have changed some minds there, or at least given some food for thought, that it's not an entirely negative picture necessarily. There are some sectors, some industries and some opportunities where there are positives, there are opportunities in the buy-in and buy-out insurance markets, for example, in terms of some employers. We'll be finishing up soon. We've had some more questions in. One question is, does this pose any issues to the rollout of automatic enrolment? And that really goes back to the point I was saying about the current pensions legal framework. It shouldn't pose any issues to the rollout of automatic enrolment. The automatic enrolment is one of the few main policies to emerge in pensions that has been entirely a domestic UK creation. If anything, it's been more influenced by Commonwealth countries than it has by EU partners.
So that's definitely the legal answer, no question about it. But I suppose a government might think over the next few years that the last thing British industry needs is a further strain on its profits and cash flow. It might therefore delay the rollout of the higher rates of contribution that are coming through, or it might not.
It already has shown its appetite to do that when economic conditions have necessitated a pause in the phasing of contributions. It shouldn't fundamentally change automatic enrolment. It certainly doesn't do anything to get rid of the problem, the mischief that the legislation is designed to tackle, which is that people aren't saving enough for their retirement. If anything, that question might become more pressing if some of the economic forecasts do become
absolutely reality. Yeah. I think I should probably just wrap up with a few closing comments. Oh, sorry, there's one more question. We've got time to do that, do you think, Ian?
Yeah. And one more question is, do you think there's a risk of planning blight, particularly in relation to EU legislation such as the General Data Protection Regulation and IORP 2?
And the answer must be yes, to some extent. I mean, as Ian explained earlier, we think that there is very little prospect of the UK not still being a full member of the EU at the time when the data protection rules come in. So I think plans to implement those need to proceed as planned, and the FCA has indicated that other in-flight legislation, which must include IORP 2, should be implemented by FCA members, that is financial institutions and companies. So I think the only advice we could responsibly give at the moment is to carry on implementing, irrespective of where you think Brexit will end up. There's another question about comms to reassure employees, and starting to list a few of the things that are coming in. I think it's very hard to say more than people are saying in general about that in a pensions context, and what they're saying in general is that nothing changed immediately as a result of the vote. There's an extended period during which the terms of our exit, if that's to proceed as expected, will be negotiated, and perhaps anything else you say would be specific to the employer in question and the funding status of its scheme.
I think the trustees can also still reassure employees that some of the protections that are in place, so the fact that the trustees are still, they've adopted risk management processes,
Yep.
that so the protections that were in place before haven't changed.
Yep. The PPS still exists.
Yeah, all of those things, yeah. It is going to depend very much on the scheme in question and how the employer is also tackling any communications.
Yeah.
Just on the European policy as well, it's just worth pointing out, if you're interested in things like the General Data Protection Regulation, if this half an hour slot hasn't completely satiated your appetite for all things Brexit, you can just go to gowlingwlg.com/Brexit, and that'll take you straight to our Brexit Untangled hub, where experts from every discipline, such as public law, environmental protection, competition, employment, and of course me and Glyn from pensions, are providing sector and practice-specific updates on the impact of Brexit in those business areas. There's also a fascinating developing set of alerts from Kieran Laird, who's an associate in the public law team, and he's looking at some of those knotty issues. So if you've been interested in the actual nuts and bolts of how negotiations to exit are going to happen, I can really recommend those. Really, some really interesting stuff coming out there.
Thanks, Ian. And on that bombshell, as they say, just a few short words to end this. First of all, thank you very much to everyone who's joined us and stayed online listening to this. We appreciate you doing that. There's a short feedback questionnaire. We would very much appreciate your thoughts, obviously with the aim of doing things which are as relevant to what you want in future as we possibly can. And as Ian has said, if there are things in it that have sparked your interest, we have more information online accessible through the Brexit page on our website. I think that brings us to a close.
It does. Thank you for joining us. And if you've got further questions or queries, send them through or talk to your normal client service teams. It's a very interesting area. It's not necessarily one we anticipated having to deal with over summer, but you can rest assured that it's something that the pensions team is looking at in all permutations and in all detail.
Thank you very much. We'll end it there. Thank you.